Thanks for watching the video. My name's Jackson, and today I'm going to go over my 351 Windsor rebuild. After giving the block a thorough washdown, it was time to install the cam. Since this motor will be going back in my 1991 Ford F250, I went with a Comp Cams Extreme Energy 4x4 flat tappet camshaft. All the parts being installed in this motor have been washed down with lacquer thinner to ensure they're clean and free of debris. This cam has a max intake duration of 254 degrees and a max exhaust duration of 262 degrees. It has a lobe separation of 111 degrees. According to Comp, this is a great cam for RVs and towing. I used a good amount of driven engine assembly grease on all the lobes and Lucas Oil assembly lube on all the journals. As you can see here, I just did my best to install the cam by hand without nicking any bearings. Next, it was time to install the thrust plate. The bolts got red Loctite and torqued down to 10 foot-pounds. All the crank bearings got a good wipe down with brake clean and then installed. Once again, I'm using this Lucas Oil engine assembly lube on all the main bearings. I went with a new Scat crank from Summit, as it was just as much to get this as it was to get my old one reground. For you master engine builders out there, don't worry, I had my whole rotating assembly balanced at the machine shop. Next, the main caps got put on with lots of lube and brand new ARP fasteners. All the bearing clearances were in between 1.5 and 2 thousandths. Per ARP, these bolts got torqued down to 100 foot-pounds. This block's been bored 60 over, so with original connecting rods, I went with Speed Pro Hypertectic 60 over pistons. The top rings were gapped 16 to 18 thousandths, and the second ring was gapped 18 to 20 thousandths. I just slipped some 5/8 tubing over the connecting rod bolts so I didn't nick the crank. Always remember that on these Ford small blocks, your chamfer should be towards your counterweight, and the dot on your piston should be pointing forward if installed correctly. After installing each piston, I put on its respective cap and snugged it down. The number on the cap should be matching the number on the connecting rod, and together they should both be facing out. These are ARP connecting rod bolts, so they should be torqued down to 50 foot-pounds. After each piston was installed, I rotated everything around to make sure there was no binding. Next step was to install the timing chain, and to do that, I needed to install a different keyway on the crank. This longer key will grab both the timing chain sprocket and the dampener real good. I had originally went with this Edelbrock timing chain, but when I degreed the cam, it came up as the cam being very retarded, so I ended up switching this out for a different timing chain. This Federal Mogul timing chain got us where we needed to be with valve timing, a couple degrees advanced. The cam bolt would go on to get torqued to 40 foot-pounds. With the bottom end together, I decided to check clearances inside the oil pan. Our oil pan did not want to clear well with the corner of the oil pump. I ended up just beating on the oil pan until it cleared. I don't like leaks, so I put RTV on both sides of this front cover gasket, especially around the water jackets. The RTV helps hold it in place too, which is also helpful. With the front cover on the dowels, you can see that the crankshaft does not line up well with the front main seal. I wasn't really paying attention and went to put it on anyway. This took a couple tries to get right as I needed a good seal around the dampener. I ended up taking both dowels out so I could get the front main seal to line up well with the dampener. Don't know if I was using the tool correctly, but I got the dampener seated in all the way. I went ahead and put the bolts in and torqued them down to 20 foot-pounds. Not all the bolts I could get to with the torque wrench, so I just kind of felt it out with a wrench. This big ARP dampener bolt got torqued down to 125 foot-pounds. Put the head gasket on and then the head. These are just some refreshed E7 iron heads. The bottom bolts got thread sealant, and all the rest of the bolts got torqued down to 100 foot-pounds. After I got these heads on, I unfortunately noticed a crack in one of the valve bosses inside the intake port, and then I noticed another crack in another valve boss in a different intake port. These heads had new valve guides pressed in, which were likely the cause of the cracking. So off camera, I took the heads off and ground out the part that was cracked and might come off. When I had gotten these heads, I went completely through them, took them completely apart and chucked them over, but I guess I missed it. After more research, I found that that's a very common place for these heads to crack at, and I honestly probably would have been fine running them, but it's better safe than sorry, so I ground it out just to make sure. I'm using ARP rocker arm studs. These were marketed as Comp Cam's rocker arm stud, but when I opened the package, they were just ARP. These got red Loctite and torqued to 25 foot-pounds. They didn't send me a torque spec sheet with the package, so there was some confusion when trying to find the right torque spec. The 5/16, which is what this base thread is, gets 25 foot-pounds, and then if you upgrade to a 3/8 base thread, you're going to want to torque them to 50 foot-pounds. With these lifters, I'm just putting a good amount of assembly grease on the bottom mating surface, and then on the sides, I'm just going to use some regular break-in oil, the same stuff I'm going to use when I run the motor. Not too concerned about the side of the lifter as the engine's going to get primed anyway. I already took a lifter through all the bores and made sure that they move freely and there's no obstructions. Before I do anything with these lifters, I already took them through a lacquer thinner bath, made sure they were free of debris and any oils. I went with BR30 Driven Racing Oil. This is a 5W30 type break-in oil. Cop Cams recommends 10W30, but according to Driven, 5W30 is going to get to the parts quicker and provide a better lubrication. The only difference between 10W30 and 5W30 is what they do at colder temperatures, which we're not too concerned about when breaking in an engine. Don't worry, these heads weren't going to stay blue for too long. I decided to throw some more paint on them while I was at it to match everything else. I'm just going with a Rust-Oleum protective enamel because honestly, this stuff is just as good as any engine paint. It's rated up to 200 degrees, but I've seen stuff get hotter than 200 degrees with this on it and be perfectly fine. Hopefully these heads aren't on there for too long anyway. I'd like to upgrade to maybe some AFR 185s later on. As far as push rods go, nothing too crazy. This is just a stock length push rod from Comp, recommended for the cam of my choice. No guide plates, so I don't need to worry about what side's hardened or any of that. These are Comp Cam roller tip rockers. I'm not doing anything too crazy with lift where I would absolutely need a roller tip rocker, but it is going to free up some friction for me, maybe free up some horsepower. And these are self-aligning, so no need for guides. Now I'm going to get into setting preload. I started by turning the engine over clockwise until the exhaust valve begins to move. This will ensure that the cam lobe is on the base circle. Next, you can take everything to zero lash by taking the push rod between your fingertips, moving it up and down while tightening the rocker arm. Once you feel that there is no more vertical movement, but you can still twist the push rod side to side freely, you're at zero lash. To set proper preload, I made 1/2 turn. Now for the exhaust valve, you're going to want to rotate the engine over until the intake valve reaches maximum lift and is almost all the way back down. This will ensure that the exhaust lobe is on its base circle and can be adjusted. Then once you're at zero lash, you can set your preload by making that 1/2 turn. With all the valves set, I check to make sure there is no binding. Next, I prep the intake gasket surface with a little bit of brake clean and a lint-free cloth. I check the fit and it looks good. I put the intake on and make sure our bowl holes line up before doing anything else. The water jacket's got a little bit of RTV. and I'm using a thick bead on the China wall. Please, please, please do not use that gasket that comes in your gasket kit. That's for the China wall. Please do not use that. Just put a thick bead of silicone on there and you'll be good. And on goes the intake. I put the bolts in by hand and let it sit for a minute for the RTV before I torqued it down. These got final torque to 15 foot-pounds. These intake manifolds take a while to torque all the way down. You're going to have to keep going around until you get a click on every bolt. I wasn't really impressed with how these jam nuts went in. They left behind a lot of metal shavings after tightening them down. I don't know if the camera can pick it up, but not very good for a brand new engine to have little shavings in it. I don't plan on having these locking nuts on here very long anyway. I'd like to upgrade them for some poly locks that will hold up a lot longer. To keep things consistent, I'm running an ARP oil pump drive shaft. The oil pump is just a Melling standard volume oil pump. There was no way I was going to get my torque wrench in there to tighten these oil pump bolts down, so I just did my best that I could with a wrench. I used red Loctite on these, so better to have Loctite and not the right torque spec than to have no Loctite and not the right torque spec in my mind. This is a Melling pickup tube to go with the Melling oil pump. This is going to be a rear sump as it's going back in my truck. Again here, just a little bit of brake clean and a lint-free rag to clean up this gasket surface. I'm using some RTV on both sides of this oil pan gasket. Going back, I wish I would have used a one-piece oil pan gasket. I'm making this video after I've already got this thing together and running. And I do have a few leaks right at the corners where the two gaskets meet. And it's just kind of a pain. I wish I would have gone with a one-piece. If you're doing this, I would definitely recommend going with a one-piece gasket. I would have liked to reuse the original oil pan, but when I went to clean it up, I noticed that there was RTV smothered all over the front of it, and I knew that wasn't good. So when I scraped that off, I found a lot of hairline cracks, which it had probably been leaking before from the previous owner of the truck. So I got this stock replacement oil pan from Jeff's Bronco Graveyard, and it was only like 60 bucks. It was the only place I could find a stock replacement oil pan other than eBay. These are ARP oil pan bolts and they get torqued to 15 foot-pounds. Before I get these valve covers on, I'm just going to spray everything down with some Comp Cam's valve train assembly lube. This stuff's really nice. It really likes to stick to whatever you're spraying it to. Might as well use all this up too. I'm going to start using studs more often. They really like to hold the gasket in place. I wish I would have used some on the intake manifold. I don't know how I feel about cork gaskets. I definitely think I'm going to be replacing these sooner than later, but just decided to throw it together so I could finish this motor up. Went with some tall aftermarket valve covers just in case of any possible clearance issues. I doubled up the gaskets with RTV for this water pump. Make sure when selecting a water pump for your small block Ford, you know which one you need. I went through a couple returning and everything, so make sure your hub height is right for your pulley and that your rotation is correct. Some spin in a clockwise rotation and some spin in a counterclockwise rotation, depending on your group and pulley system, whether you have a V-band or a serpentine belt. The bolts going in around the water jackets are getting thread sealant. This is a Tough Stuff water pump with a 5.735 hub height and a 5/8 pilot, and it's reverse rotation. These bolts are getting torqued anywhere from 15 to 20 foot-pounds. Since I won't be using the exhaust ports out the back of the heads, I'm going to block them off with block-off plates I bought from LMR. These are just Summit brand shorty headers. I bought them because they're cheap and they'll work with my existing Y pipe. The bolts got some anti-seize before they went in the block. I put the thermostat housing on for now, but ended up going with a 180-degree thermostat. For the dipstick, I ended up having to bend up a piece of metal to help hold it in place. For spark plugs, I went with NGK UR5s. These will get gapped to 50 thousandths because I'll be running a DUI HEI distributor. Next, I had to put the flex plate on, and to do that, I had to take the engine off the engine stand. I don't know what it is about these carb mount pull plates, but I just can't trust them, so I'm throwing a strap on there for extra insurance. The bolt holes will only line up in the correct position. I spun it all the way around just to make sure. This is a 164 tooth Summit Racing SFI approved flex plate. If you have an E4OD transmission, you're most likely going to have a 164 tooth flex plate. These ARP bolts got red Loctite on the threads and lube on the flange. And final torque to 85 foot-pounds. I'm using my left arm to hold the crank bolt so the engine doesn't spin on me. And just like that, she was back in. Let me know down in the comments what you thought about the video. The next video I have out should be of the cam break-in. Thanks guys for watching. You have a good one.